Ever since coming to London, I've spent significant periods on my day sitting on the London Underground.
Sitting?
Well, sometimes if it's late, I get a seat, but in the morning, I certainly don't. But I'm in the cramped London Underground. I'm wondering why it's so bad when it stops at random stations because of distancing requirements, because of different scheduling that's simply terrible. It means that my train doesn't go to where I want to go. Instead, I have to wait for the next train in order to reach my destination. And so it made me wonder why the London Underground is as it is. So, like most of our infrastructure here in the UK, the London Underground, which is better known as the Tube nowadays, is one of those things that we built earlier than anybody else, but as a result, certainly some parts of it is terribly outdated today. In fact, it began operation in January of 1863, which was a whopping 161 years ago. And just to put that into context, in 1863, Thomas Edison was yet to invent the light bulb, nor had Alexander Graham Bell invent the telephone. Since then, we've fought 2 world wars in addition to many regional conflicts. We've progressed significantly in terms of healthcare, technology, and equality in society. So it's really been such a long period of time since the London Underground first existed, and it actually still baffles me how we've managed to build a London Underground over 150 years previously.
In 1860, 13.5 million people travelled by train to London Bridge Station alone. But major stations like this had been built on the outskirts of the city.
So the only way all those people could get to their offices, stores and workshops in central London was by using its chronically congested streets. But in 1863, those clever Victorians came up with a solution to ease congestion on the streets.
An incredible innovation that would transform the shape of London, the Underground.
The London Underground started as a privately run operation by the Metropolitan Railway from Paddington to Farringdon. Other companies, such as the Metropolitan and District Railway, soon followed and opened their own railway services, which formed part of the Circle and District Line today from South Kensington to Westminster. These London Underground services were built using a cut and cover method, which is exactly like how it sounds, which involves digging a trench, placing the tracks for the trains in, and covering up the tracks so that the buildings and roads could be built on top. And actually, in the early days, most of the London Underground was built directly underneath existing roads. Now, this method was very much necessary because the early London Underground used steam engines. And if you've ever been or seen a steam engine, you know that they certainly need ventilation. Otherwise, you would be in a very difficult situation medically, I would suggest. However, in 1890, the City and South London Railway did not want to negotiate with the property owners on the surface level, which would be necessary for a traditional cut and cover operation. And so the first deep level tube was born. This London Underground service, which ran from Stockwell to the modern-day Bank Station, was provided using electric locomotives, which is very similar to the arrangement today. In 1900, the Central London Railway, which was colloquially known as the Twopenny Tube, was opened. And even these comparatively later London Underground services still predate metro services in much of the advanced world by very many years. So these deep-level tubes had smaller tunnels, which meant that they could only accommodate smaller trains for service, as opposed to the wider mainline trains on the cut and cover lines. As such, to this day, the deep-level tubes have smaller trains than the cut and cover tubes, meaning they're actually not cost-compatible. Throughout the early 1900s, though, the ownership of various lines were gradually consolidated, and by the end of the Second World War, all London Underground lines were state-owned thanks to a new Labour government. And actually, I suspect if I gave you a London Underground map from the 1960s, you would see a lot of similar features compared to the modern London Underground map, which just shows that development was really done 150 years ago, and actually we've made relatively little advancement since then. But the 1960s did see the London Underground's latest line, which is the Victoria Line.
Deep under London, a new section of the Victoria Line rumbled into service. For the Queen, who opened stage 3 of the line, it was only the second trip of her life in the tube. But the very automated facilities of what is now the most technically advanced underground services in the world are a far cry from those of 30 years ago when she made her other tube journey.
Now, to commuters, rush hours on the Victoria Line is a nightmare. Just try the northbound platform at Oxford Circus on a Friday evening, which I've tried and it's been truly horrific.
If you just joined us, please stand behind the yellow line and keep moving down to your right on the platform. Your next service is calling to Walthamstow Central. Please stand behind the yellow line. It's there for your safety. And keep moving down to the right of the platform.
But the Victoria Line proved to be immensely successful. It moves the most people per mile of track on the entire tube network, and it's an incredibly efficient operation because the spacing between stations are longer, and therefore it provides a more express service between major hubs in London.
That stat about moving the most people per mile of track is a bit sketchy though, because the Victoria Line only extends as far as Zone 3, whereas the Central Line, for example, extends quite far.
The Victoria Line also has more advanced signalling technology than the rest of the tube network, enabling an unmatched train frequency of 36 trains per hour during peak times, or a train every 100 seconds. And speaking from personal experience, I've never ever had to wait for a Victoria Line, except that one time where I missed one because the door slammed in my face and I had to wait for the next one. At the turn of the millennium, though, the Jubilee Line extension was born.
The new £1 billion extension would link Green Park with Stratford, providing a vital new service to South London and Docklands. But there are fears that the government are considering axing 2 stations at Southwark and Bermondsey from the scheme to save £50 million.
In many ways, this was meant to represent the future of the tube, with platform-edge screens on all stations, plenty of lifts and escalators facilitating step-free access to the platforms, and large ticket halls. Canary Wharf Station perhaps is the best example of that. Unfortunately, though, further extensions on the tube line have been few and far between, with only the rather modest Northern Line extension to Battersea Power Station being constructed in recent years. Before we move on, Suresh, do you know why the London Underground is referred to as the Tube?
Nope, but I can guess that maybe it's because the tunnels are like tubes.
That is actually entirely correct. And when I previously talked about what is now the Northern Line, the cross-section of their tunnels looked very tube-like, which is why people started referring to it as tube. However, to anybody who's been on the London Underground, which includes me, it's very clear that the London Underground has several challenges. And I think this is caused by a combination of the lack of funding and the archaic nature of some of the tracks. Some trains, such as those running on the Piccadilly and Bakerloo lines, are over 50 years old. Whilst they're set for replacement as part of the new Tube for London programme, this has been plagued with delays, and full rollout of the new rolling stock won't occur until close to the end of this decade, which seems like an awfully long time away.
This is the future of the Piccadilly line. You're looking at walk-through carriages, wider all-double doorways to help customers get on and off more easily, enhanced digital display screens for customer information, on-train CCTV cameras for additional security, and, for the first time on a deep tube train, air conditioning.
Meanwhile, Central Line commuters, which includes us, Suresh, would argue that the Central Line is also in dire need of new trains. The current trains from the 90s have notoriously unreliable DC motors. In fact, if you ever go on a peak rush hour Central Line train, you can feel the uselessness of the motors when it tries to accelerate a train full of angry commuters, but it just sort of struggles and the acceleration just stops until maybe 3 seconds later the acceleration kicks back in and we slowly, very slowly, accelerate out of the station.
We are facing quite a difficult set of problems. We have a really ageing fleet here. The fleet is 30 years old. We have a big investment program into that fleet, which will see it completely refreshed. Unfortunately, that's been pushed to the right in terms of time because we've had uncertainty around government funding for that refresh of the fleet. So over the next few weeks, we're doing a lot. So we've significantly increased our customer information so people know what's happening when they turn up to the Central Line.
Initially, though, the Central Line was included in the new Tube for London programme. However, due to budget shortfalls, TfL decided they were unable to include the Central Line in the upgrade. Instead, the Central Line Improvement Programme has been commissioned, which is set to cost £500 million, as opposed to the £1.5 billion of buying new trains. This, however, in typical UK infrastructure style, has been full of delays, and despite work on refurbishing the trains going on for over a year, only a single refurbished train has entered service. The Central Line represents another issue that the London Underground unfortunately suffers from, which is heat.
The Underground's the only spot for comfort when the days are hot. Well, at least back in 1926, when this poster was commissioned. Today, however, that's obviously no longer the case. So, what went wrong?
As we mentioned, the initial deep tube lines were electrically powered. As such, there was no need for any ventilation shaft, unlike the steam engine-powered counterparts on the subsurface lines. However, the repeated braking of the train generates lots of heat thanks to the kinetic energy being converted into heat energy. And this heat is trapped in the London clay, which is brilliant for engineers trying to drill tube lines. And so some parts of the deep tube are unbearably hot in the summer.
Some of our trains are older trains, 30, 40 years old, which aren't air conditioned, and you know, on some days in summer they can be intolerable. And so we're lobbying the government for capital support to try and upgrade those trains as soon as we can. So the good news is all the new trains we're ordering now are air conditioned.
Another problem on the tube is that until very recently, mobile signal coverage in the deep tube tunnels was non-existent. Thankfully, TfL has started to remedy that, and by the end of this year, we should expect good signal coverage in the majority of the stations. Signalling issues have also meant the trains are frequently unreliable.
The Metropolitan line is part suspended between Baker Street and Aldgate. The Hammersmith and City line is suspended. The District line is operating with severe delays due to earlier service disruptions. The Bakerloo line is operating with severe delays. The Central line is operating with severe delays.
Some of the oldest parts of the Underground network, like the District line, are consistently suffering with signalling faults that result in cancellation and delays, making service unusable for certain commuters that rely on the service. And despite the 272 stations on the London Underground, only 33 are south of the River Thames, making South London incredibly underserved. Historically, this was due to difficulty tunnelling south of the Thames, but more recently, funding has been a major hurdle to further expansion, such as the Bakerloo line extension that is proposed. Still, TfL and the London Underground do many things very well. For example, they have been very resourceful with the track that it has. The London Overground and the Elizabeth line are prime examples, with some existing tracks being used and service rebranded. The Overground has been extremely successful at increasing the utilisation of existing infrastructure whilst serving rural communities otherwise deprived of service. Recently, TfL has announced new branding for the different branches of the Overground, making it easier for passengers to understand the different services provided.
The London Tube map is about to change as the Overground is split into 6 separate lines. Each name has a special meaning. Windrush after Lioness Caribbean celebrated England's first women haulers who won the Euros in the early 1940s. while the Liberty line, running through Havering, miles north in London's a special royal status treated HIV/AIDS patients in the 1980s.
The Elizabeth line, meanwhile, has been a massive success despite exceeding its budget significantly. It has provided fast and reliable service to central London and serves major rail hubs as well as the financial district of Canary Wharf. To me, it's just amazing how we can still have track that's 150 years old and still running. So despite the numerous issues that the London Underground has, I'm still thankful that it exists and most of the time gets me to where I want to go in a quick and mostly reliable manner.